for now. Well, let's continue to talk about all the issues emerging from this. Let's speak to the former US ambassador to Greece, Daniel Speckhard. Also joining me from Berlin is Hans-Werner Sinn, Professor of Economics and Public Finance at the University of Munich. He's also served on the German Economy Ministry's Advisory Council. Thanks to both of you for being here with us on today's Global. Professor, to you first of all, you've consistently argued in favour of Greece's exit from the euro. Why, in your view, would it actually help Greece?
Well, the bankruptcy, of course, is a disaster, which we see now. If there is no more money coming from other countries, this disaster can only be ended by exiting, because that would mean that the imports become more expensive, that people buy domestic products, the tourists return, and the flight capital returns, buys real estate, renovates it, and so on. So empirically, after a year or so after an exit, there's an upswing. But of course, the chaos which is coming from the bankruptcy, the insolvency, is in itself not desirable.
So you don't doubt that there would be chaos, but you say about a year on, then perhaps things will pick up. I'll come back to that point in a moment, but Daniel, to you there in Washington, from the American perspective, as they look on, how concerned is America at events here in Europe?
Well, they're very concerned, and Secretary Liu has been on the phone over the last week trying to encourage German and French counterparts to push forward whatever they can to get an agreement. I think that reflects that this isn't only an economic issue for Greece, and not only for the Eurozone, but it could affect us more widely internationally. But also, it's a reflection that there's probably a lot of political and security issues that we haven't even really come to grips with yet of a potential Greek exit.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the U.S. and NATO have a base on Crete, which is very close to the challenges and problems in the Middle East, and also a staging point for Afghanistan. Greece is part of the European energy security strategy for Europe as it faces challenges with Russia. EU and NATO are consensus organizations, and Greece is a member of both, and you need consensus to get agreement on things like sanctions against Russia in relationship to its issues in Ukraine, counterterrorism cooperation between the EU and the United States, and even more directly with Greece, which has had already 46,000 immigrants just in the first 5 months. About half of what's coming from the Middle East into Europe are coming through Greece. So lots of issues there that are much broader and wider than just the economic ones.
Let me return to the professor. You talked about things picking up. I mean, there have been varieties of views of the catastrophe that would follow a Greek exit. I mean, Standard & Poor's today, the credit agency, was talking about a 20% cut in growth over the next 4 years. Do you not accept that? Do you think actually Greece ultimately would be in a better place? That seems to buck the trend of a lot of analysis.
Yeah, well, that number is absurdly false. We have studied those 71 countries that defaulted after 1980 and devalued, and we found that in 3/4 of the cases, economic growth was picking up already after 1 year, and there is a separate study of Oxford Economics about the 70 countries again, and it comes to the same conclusion. So this is certainly not right. We do have a problem. The problem is the bankruptcy. I repeat that. The problem is not the Grexit. The Grexit after the bankruptcy is a solution. Of course, it might even be better if someone else provided money to prevent the disaster. But who does it? I mean, Greece has received 330 billion euros of public funds, which is 185% of GDP. This is an enormous sum.
But in terms of how you get to a better place, I mean, you've written that wealthy Greek money would repatriate back to Greece. You have talked about everything becoming cheaper. You talk about a faster recovery in terms of construction. Isn't that rather simplistic?
No, this is the experience which we have had. I mean, a bankruptcy is a disaster, but, you know, the world has seen 180 such disasters after the war. Greece has seen 6 bankruptcies. 2 already in the euro. 1 was already 2012, the biggest haircut in history with 105 billion euros. Now there is the second bankruptcy of Greece in the euro. How long do you want to stretch this? You know, what is the contagion, the political contagion? Suppose you always solve the problems of a country which has an import surplus, which no one wants to finance, no one in the market wants to finance with public money. Wouldn't there be contagion for every other European country? This, in the end, is unsustainable, and the whole European project will sink in a morass of debt.
Well, I'll come back to that point.
We have driven this very far already.
I'll come back to that point because you've written about that in your book, The Euro Trap. But Daniel, let me just ask you a question in terms of the American perspective of how the negotiations have been handled over the last few weeks and months, because there's been increasing frustration from the Eurozone ministers. I mean, one finance minister spoke of exhaustion today, of trying to make progress and watching the Greek position just flip and flip and flip. I mean, how do you think these negotiations have been handled?
Well, I think obviously they've been handled terribly, and what you're seeing is the reflection of a government that's really only 5 months old, that has never governed before as an organization, that's trying to manage a government that's not very easy to manage to begin with. And so I'm not very surprised with the results over 5 months, and I think it was partly to be expected. Jumping back to that point, though, about a Greek exit, I think that's partly why I think we need to be very careful here as we look forward. The professor may be right that over the longer term, it would be better for Greece to have the drachma. They'd be able to devalue, they'd be able to be more competitive in a more politically satisfactory way to the population. The challenge is right now, this government is in a political crisis, not just an economic one, and to manage a Greek exit at this right point in time is going to take a lot of good planning and good implementation, and I don't think they're up to it.
Professor, just a final thought, because I said in your book, The Euro Trap, now you predicted several decades of crisis. In terms of everything that we've seen over the last few months, are you still wedded to that rather gloomy prediction?
Several decades, I did not say. I spoke of a decade and a long period, because Europe has a realignment problem. The euro brought an inflationary credit bubble to southern Europe, Greece in particular, and the country became too expensive to be competitive. Now you can go down with your prices, cut your wages, cut your prices. Does that work? I doubt so, because you cannot reduce the internal credit. People are over-indebted. People have to pay their rents. This possibility of real devaluation is not there, so the only possibility is an open devaluation, and I would say temporary. They can return to the euro at a later point in time, and the community of states cannot leave Greece alone. They would have to help Greece with financing sensitive imports like pharmaceuticals or energy during some transition period. We cannot say no to everything.
Well, there we have to leave it. Professor there in our Berlin studios and Daniel Speckhard in Washington. Thanks, both of you, for joining us and those thoughts on our programme.